Thanks for joining me again as we look back at another great classic film. This is an Australian film from the country's most prolific independent director, featuring a number of great Australian actors and telling a very personal story of marriage breakdown in a thoughtful and sensitive way. It is My First Wife from 1984. The film's director Paul Cox was someone I knew. He joked that his status as our most highly successful independent director gave him the honour to go to film bodies and investors begging for money for each new film that he wanted to make. He knew that his films were always more successful on the international art house circuit than they were in Australia, which is something that I find personally disappointing. This, his sixth feature film, was based on the recent breakdown of Cox's marriage. Paul told me that he had waited a long time to get married, wanting to make sure that he married the right person in the hope of making the marriage a success. Its breakdown was devastating, and as a kind of therapy, he started to develop the script for this film. He showed it to Bob Ellis, the two having worked together on Cox's breakout film Man of Flowers. They wrote the screenplay together, which according to Ellis only took a day and a half. This portrayal of a marriage breakdown is honest and sharply observant. The two central characters are presented in different but equally unflattering ways. And to Cox's credit, he avoided presenting the wife in a nasty way at a time in his life when this may have felt justified. There are no clean resolutions and no winners. Issues such as betrayal, the erosion of trust, the grief of one parent losing access to a child, the simultaneous loss associated with a dying parent, fear of abandonment, the risk of starting a new relationship too soon, and attempted suicide are all seamlessly woven through the film. Once the script was complete, as with all Paul's films, things developed organically. Cox was someone who liked to work with a cast and crew that he was familiar with, and as a result he worked with a number of people on a regular basis. For John Hargeaves, cast as John, this was his first film for Paul Cox, but they would work together again on Hargeaves' last film, Lust and Revenge, in 1996. Hargeaves was one of Australia's most popular actors between the late 1970s and into the 1990s, admired for his good looks, his great ability, and his wry and biting sense of humour. For Wendy Hughes, cast as Helen, this was her third film with Cox, having already appeared in his third feature film, Costas, and as the lead in his critically acclaimed film, Lonely Hearts. She went on to appear in Lust and Revenge, again with Hargeaves, and Salvation in 2008. Charles Bud Tingwell, cast as Helen's father, first worked with Cox on this film before going on to make 5 films with him, including Innocence and Human Touch, where he appeared with Julia Blake, Handle with Care, and Salvation, which he made with Wendy Hughes. Julia Blake, cast as Kirsten in her third film with Cox, returned soon after Lonely Hearts in 1982 and Man of Flowers in 1983. In total they made 7 films together, including the Paperboy episode of the ensemble film Winners, Cactus, Innocence and Human Touch. Like a large number of Cox's films, most of the shooting took place in his home in Albert Park. Cox had bought the house in the late 1970s after it was closed as a state-run drug rehabilitation centre. Paul had been walking past as it was being auctioned when he decided to bid, despite not having the money. He won, then scrambled to find a way to pay for it. It was a great investment because, again, it featured in so many of his films. Many of Paul Cox's films feature trains, and this is no exception. Cox grew up in Holland during the Second World War and during the post-war period. The first sign he saw that things were returning to normal was that the trains began running again. A moving train is often used as a punctuation mark in his films, separating the story into different sections or movements. While filming the fight between John and Helen, Hargeaves actually punched Wendy Hughes during the first take. Paul Cox insisted that they do it again in spite of the actors' protests. It was the second take with simulated punches which Cox felt worked better on film and made it into the final cut. Establishing the character of John as a composer and an announcer on a classical musical radio station creates a perfect fit with the film's soundtrack. Paul Cox had a preference for classical music in all of his films, largely because the rights were affordable. At the time of this film, the Berlin Wall was still up, meaning that you could travel behind the Iron Curtain, buy a record, and then use that music in a film without having to pay exorbitant royalties. This explains the use of music from the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra, the Budapest Symphony Orchestra, and the Berliner Philharmoniker, formerly from East Berlin. Worthy of mention is the film's beautifully crafted ending, which doesn't tie up all the complex threads that it creates, but leads us to believe that the characters will commit to the effort required to make the challenges of their new lives somehow manageable. The film was well received by the critics, with David Stratton nominating it as the Best Australian Film of the Year. It went on to gross $413,000 at the Australian box office. At the Australian Film Institute Awards, John Hargeaves won Best Actor, Paul Cox picks up Best Director, and Cox and Bob Ellis won Best Original Screenplay. It was nominated in 4 more categories, including Best Actress for Wendy Hughes and Best Film, losing out to Careful He Might Hear You. Paul Cox also won the 1986 Grand Prix Award at the Flanders International Film Festival. So lots of really good reasons to watch this film. It's a familiar story told in a very unfamiliar way, surprising you with its depth and complexity. Great performances from Australian acting legends John Hargeaves and Wendy Hughes, interwoven with both moving and comic scenes written by Bob Ellis and Paul Cox. So, what I suggest you do is that you go to our website, find our virtual screening page, find the link to this particular film, click on it and watch it. As always, see what you think. We'd always love you to come back, provide some commentary, whether you'd recommend the film for other people to watch as well. And then we're back in the not too distant future for our next classic films review. Catch you next time.